Thesis of the evening, Mr. Noah Richard Stewart with his thesis, Governmental Sanctioned Terrorism, or Government Sanctioned Terrorism. I added an extra piece there. Give him a hand.
In early 2002, the US and Pakistani governments found and captured Abu Zubaydah, a suspected high-ranking member of Al-Qaeda. He was then turned over to the Central Intelligence Agency. The Bush administration authorized the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, and Zubaydah became subject to what the Red Cross has now deemed torture. At first, the CIA treated him harshly, but as time went on, his treatment became even worse. Zubaydah endured music played at extreme volumes, temperature extremes, beatings, isolation, confinement in a small box, waterboarding, and sexual humiliation. Within a few months, Zubaydah had lost his left eye. He was waterboarded 83 times in 1 month, once for 35 seconds straight before he was allowed to breathe again. As he later described, "I struggled against the straps, trying to breathe, but it was hopeless. I thought I was going to die. I lost control of my urine. Since then, I still lose control of my urine when under stress." Interrogators would wrap a towel around his head and use it to beat his head against the wall. Zubaydah was constantly naked, and any time he tried to sleep, he was sprayed in the face with water. While in custody, the Bush administration touted the valuable intelligence they were gaining from him, but it was later revealed that they had learned next to nothing. Zubaydah and 13 other detainees in Guantanamo suffered inhumane treatment for years, but the actions of the Bush administration are not the first time the U.S. has resorted to torture as a means of gaining intelligence. It was recently discovered that in the 50s, the CIA used both volunteers and unwitting citizens in experiments designed to control their minds by drugging them with hallucinogens such as LSD. This was called Project MK-Ultra, and part of this project involved testing a long-time KGB interrogation technique, stress positions, specifically forcing victims to stand with their arms out for days on end. During this process, their skin starts to swell, lesions grow on their legs, and they begin to hallucinate. They are essentially being forced to hurt themselves, the psychological implications of which are unimaginable. It was the discovery of this technique that led the U.S. to utilize a very specific kind of torture, psychological. The nature of psychological torture is such that it leaves very little visible marks on victims, and as such, is much more difficult to prove in a court. Since its first use in the 50s, psychological torture combined with physical abuse has been a mainstay of U.S. interrogation operations, and since it is difficult to define and harder to prove, nothing has yet stopped it. The United States must stop utilizing torture as a means of interrogation. Firstly, because it is illegal under U.S. law, UN law, and the Geneva Conventions. Secondly, because it has fatally damaged our international reputation. And lastly, because torture is ineffective at best and puts American lives in danger at worst. Now, the United States has both its own laws and has signed off on several human rights commissions banning torture, but through definition issues, legal loopholes, and the inherent secrecy of psychological torture, the United States always gets away with it. The Clinton administration ratified the UN Convention Against Torture in 1994, but it was not without a caveat. Clinton placed a reservation on one word in the convention, and that word was intentional. The UN defines torture as severe physical pain or suffering intentionally inflicted on a person, whereas the new United States Code states that the pain must be specifically intended. This can easily be used to paint any mental harm caused by physical abuse as a side effect, and that the main purpose was just to coerce the prisoner. It even further narrows down what qualifies as torture by only listing 4 specific acts. 1, severe physical pain or suffering. 2, the administration of mind-altering drugs. 3, the threat of imminent death. And 4, the threat that another person will be imminently killed. This law is written to look like it's banning plenty of bad practices, and it is, but its specificity means that anything else is a complete gray area. It even further narrows down what qualifies as torture by stating that any prolonged mental harm caused by torture must have been caused by these 4 specific acts. The inclusion of these qualifiers makes any evidence of criminality into an opinion rather than a concrete law. The U.S. Army Surgeon General Kevin Kiley once asked, "How loud does a scream have to be?" Now, under all of these laws, the U.S.'s actions can easily be defined as torture. As stated earlier, the UN's definition of torture is severe physical or mental pain intentionally inflicted on a person. The physical pain utilized by the CIA is obvious. Detainees in Guantanamo endured being kicked, having their heads slammed against the wall, being shoved in confinement boxes 2.5 feet high and long, and of course, frequent sessions of waterboarding. Waterboarding is when a person lies back, a cloth is placed over their face, and water is poured over it. It simulates not only the physical pain of suffocation and drowning, but the fear of death that comes along with it. A prisoner named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded 183 times in 1 month, with sessions lasting up to an hour. When Abu Zubaydah was first captured, he had been shot several times and had his wounds stitched up prior to interrogation. When he was then interrogated, he was shoved in a confinement box, and his body became so strained that the gash on his leg opened up again, and eventually he fainted from blood loss. Now, the CIA's captives may have suffered greatly physically, but they also became permanently mentally damaged. The entire time these men were in custody, they were in constant solitary confinement. They had no access to legal representation, their families, any other people to talk to, or even something as basic as sunlight. Detainees placed in confinement boxes experienced hysteria, collapsed in uncontrollable sobbing, and pounded in desperation against the boxes that confined them. Detainees were constantly kept naked and sometimes covered in their own waste that they were previously forced to stand in, even though female guards and interrogators were present. In addition, many of them were regularly verbally threatened by their interrogators, including threats of, quote, electric shocks, infection with HIV, sodomy of the detainee, the arrest and rape of their families, being brought to the verge of death and back again, and an interrogation process to which no rules applied. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was not even allowed to pray for several weeks in Guantanamo. These men felt dehumanized, and rightfully so. Their rights, guaranteed by all of these laws, have been revoked in the name of national security. Ironically, it was that very national security that was compromised by the U.S.'s choice to use torture. The political and social cost of torture cannot be ignored. Perhaps the most infamous scandal related to U.S. interrogation is the 2004 leaking of pictures from Abu Ghraib, a prison just west of Baghdad. These were pictures of United States soldiers humiliating, torturing, raping, and murdering their prisoners. There was a firestorm of outrage over it, and the Bush administration was forced to address it. They stated that this was an isolated case, and they would take measures to right these wrongs, but it was far too late for that. In 2008, Senator John McCain was speaking with an imprisoned al-Qaeda leader about what had allowed them to establish an anti-U.S. force in Iraq. Two things, the prisoner said. One, the chaos after the success of the initial invasion, and two, the greatest recruitment tool, Abu Ghraib. But these are the words of a terrorist, so how can we be expected to believe them? Well, according to a University of Pennsylvania study, the pictures from Abu Ghraib and other torture scandals directly contributed to the introduction of foreign citizens into extremist groups in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Senior U.S. officials in Kuwait found that, quote, the mistreatment of detainees at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib was the single most important motivating factor in persuading foreign jihadists to join the war against the U.S., unquote. The Obama administration then eventually decided to stop releasing more pictures from Abu Ghraib. Why? Well, a Saudi Arabian official testified that Saudi police had arrested over 250 people trying to leave the country to join extremist groups. Robert Pape, a professor from the University of Chicago, found 26 martyrdom videos where the suicide bombers themselves stated that Abu Ghraib was the main motivation for their attacks. Reporter Mark Danner questioned a local Iraqi man about the reasons for the anti-U.S. sentiment there and was shocked by the potency of his answer. He said, quote, it is a great shame for the foreigners to put a bag over our heads, to make us lie on the ground with their shoe on our necks. It is a great shame for the whole tribe. It is the duty of that man to attack them, to wash the shame. No sleep. We cannot have sleep until we have revenge. They have to kill soldiers. Jihadists themselves took advantage of this. It became extremely easy to portray the U.S. as the villain in the conflict, and images of Americans torturing people became a motif in jihadist propaganda. General Stanley McChrystal recounted how much the pictures from Abu Ghraib hurt the United States war effort. He said, the Iraqi people felt that it was proof positive that the Americans were doing the exact same things that Saddam Hussein had done. They felt it was proof that everything bad they had ever heard about the Americans was true. These kinds of things didn't only happen during the Bush years either. ISIS fighters purposefully clothed their detainees in the same jumpsuits Guantanamo detainees wear. And there are even reports that they have begun using waterboarding. And while it is likely that ISIS would use cruel interrogation techniques regardless of U.S. activity, for the average Middle Eastern citizen, it's more and more difficult to morally distinguish the two sides. In choosing to utilize torture while being a world power, the United States has universally lowered acceptable practices. It showed that standards of humane behavior do not apply to either side, terrorist or not. Now, the most common complaint brought up by defenders of torture is the claim that it works, and that the United States gains valuable information from it. But this has been shown to be false in countless examples, even throughout the rest of human history. The ancient Roman jurist Ulpian once wrote that, "For some people are so strong of body and soul that they heed pain very little, while others are so susceptible to pain that they will tell any lie rather than suffer it." Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was one such person who was able to resist torture. CIA personnel say that they thought waterboarding was very ineffective on him, that his detainee hated it, but he knew that he could manage. One of his interrogators is quoted saying that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed responded better to a sense of comforts and importance rather than confrontational approaches. This ability to resist is actually fairly common due to the nature of our opponents. Since they know what we do to prisoners, the logical thing to do would be to train them to be able to resist torture, especially their highest-ranking officers like the ones we keep in Guantanamo. 7 CIA detainees produced a grand total of 0 intelligence while they were in custody, and many others provided only lies. CIA personnel in internal emails stated that they could not get prisoners to cooperate or give any sort of accurate intelligence. The Senate Intelligence Committee closely studied 20 cases where they believed that where the CIA had stated that they had gained valuable intelligence from enhanced interrogation. In every case, the Senate found that the intelligence gained was either not valuable or a complete lie. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is also often cited by the CIA as having provided a large amount of intelligence necessary for determining the location of Osama bin Laden, but the Senate also found this to be false. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured in 2003, whereas Osama bin Laden was taken out in 2011. Tommy Victor, a spokesperson from the National Security Council, said this, quote, "The truth is this, if we had some kind of smoking gun intelligence from waterboarding in 2003, we would have taken out Osama bin Laden in 2003, unquote. One of Abu Zubayr's interrogators is quoted saying that he stopped talking when CIA contractors began to use nudity, sleep deprivation, and waterboarding on him. In fact, not only did every bit of information Abu Zubaydah told us we gained before we started torturing him, as soon as we introduced torture, he completely shut his mouth. Now, I believe central to the position presented by more modern proponents of enhanced interrogation is the claim that it works. Is the claim that waterboarding is not torture, and therefore it's morally okay and doesn't make us look bad. During the process of waterboarding, water may or may not actually get into the victim's mouth or nose, depending on the setup. But this is secondary to the person's psychological experience. When the wave of water hits, their body reacts as if they are actually drowning, and their mind believes they're actually about to die, the mental effects of which are absolutely torturous. It is very akin to a mock execution, a process where the victim is led to believe he is about to be executed and lined up to get shot. Waterboarding is a shortcut to that same psychological end of causing the stress and fear of being close to death. Waterboarding is torture by all definitions. Now, when considering the use of torture, we inevitably come to a difficult question: the ticking time bomb scenario. Professor Alan Dershowitz writes in his book, Why Terrorism Works, that torture should be a judiciary ordered warrant, and to argue for this, he outlines many Americans' worst fears. The scenario involves a captured terrorist who refuses to divulge information about the imminent use of weapons of mass destruction, capable of killing thousands of civilians. Upon first glance, surely we would all agree to torture this one person to save the life of thousands of others. But it is important to examine the logic and likelihood of such a scenario before we go signing it into law. It assumes a completely improbable set of factors. The government has to capture a terrorist at the exact moment between the plot start and the bomb's explosion. Next, the CIA or FBI has to know enough about the plot to know that the terrorist is a part of it, but not the detail of where the bomb is. Nothing like this has ever transpired in the real world. We do not create laws based off of imaginary nightmare scenarios. Now, let's move from theoretical events to things that really happened. In 2001, a man named Zacharias Moussaoui was arrested for being a possible suicide hijacker. The FBI pressed for a search warrant, and the field supervisor even told his superiors that he was trying to prevent someone from crashing planes into the World Trade Center. There was no evidence that Moussaoui was a terrorist. Then, when 9/11 happened, everyone knew what should have been. If only we had interrogated him, if only we had tortured him, we might have been able to stop 9/11. But unfortunately, that is not the reality. It is easy to say that in hindsight, when in movies and TV shows, the CIA and FBI are portrayed as all-knowing intelligence gods, but in the real world, they're just giant bureaucracies like the DMV. The government, in the years following 9/11, arrested 5,000 terror suspects. They had evidence to charge only 3, and only one conviction. Now, let's say we applied Professor Dershowitz's plan to these events. The CIA would have gotten torture warrants for 4,999 innocent people. Then, what do we do with all of them? Do we spend millions to keep them barely alive in Guantanamo? Or do we fall into the hole at the end of the slippery slope of torture called extrajudicial executions, like the CIA's Phoenix program did in Vietnam? The US's use of torture has proven to be far too politically costly, dishonest, and largely ineffective. Our leaders must look past the immediate intelligence potential of torture and consider the consequences. Torture is not a tool of the strong and powerful. It is, according to Admiral John Hudson, the technique of choice for the lazy, the stupid, and the pseudo-tough. Thank you.
On Noah's panel, we have Alan Walk. Alan Walk is a math teacher at Veritas Academy. He is also currently working on a PhD in learning technology at UT. He cares about topics akin to social justice and the well-being of others, especially their eternal well-being. He wants everyone to see Jesus as he is, the great I am. Christy Wilson has been working on the Veritas board for 6 years. Prior to hanging out at Veritas, she was an attorney who, at the height of her career, investigated judges. She is also the mother of 4, right? One of whom is a graduating senior this year. We also have Katie Loeveno, who joined the Veritas staff in the early fall of 2011 and is the Academy's Advancement Director. Prior to coming to Veritas, Katie taught various levels of high school English in the public school system and served as a missionary associate at La Cosecha in Querétaro, Mexico. Nailed it. Both of these opportunities follow the completion of her undergraduate degrees at Texas State University in English, Education, and Communication Studies. In addition to her role at Veritas, she currently serves on the advisory board for the Terry Foundation, a scholarship organization committed to developing future leaders of Texas through access to a college education. Last and certainly not least, we have Graham Donaldson, who immigrated to the US in 2012. He got his bachelor's at the University of Toronto and his master's in theology at Wycliffe College. He's taught English since 2012 when he joined us, and he is the exemplary of the Canadian ideal, which means that he is just slightly above average. All right, so in front of you, you have a paddle. If you show me the white side, it means that you have a new line. Sorry. Don't cover your mouth with the mic inside. And if you show me the red side, it means you have a follow-up question. So the floor is open.
Let him have.
So you spoke of, I guess, showing that torture is a bad thing, but are there any alternatives to torture to obtain information that we would seem relevant or necessary? Yes. So almost all of the things that I talked about were done by the CIA. The FBI accuracy has never had any accusations of doing any of these things. And that's because they use a technique for interrogation called rapport building, which is essentially getting the prisoner to like you. And that sounds kind of silly, but let's see. As an example, in World War II, Major Sherwood F. Morin, he fought in the Pacific War, and he spoke Japanese and knew about Japanese culture. And he became extremely successful at speaking to Japanese prisoners. In fact, he was so successful that the Navy and the Marines actually started training their soldiers to speak Japanese and learn Japanese culture. They became the most effective interrogators in all of World War II. They were able to get full Japanese order of battle intelligence within 48 hours of talking to a prisoner, which is far beyond anything the CIA has ever even pretended to cover up.
Great job, Noah. In your presentation, you said that waterboarding is torture by all definitions. You cited the Red Cross as the body that made reference to the fact that the United States was engaging in torture. But the UN hasn't, and the World Court in The Hague, they haven't filed any war crime charges against any American operatives. So does the UN consider waterboarding torture, or is the UN not sort of following through on prosecuting torture? Can you help me figure out which one it is?
Right. So, so the United States, there are far worse forms of torture than what the United States does. Obviously, the United States tends to purposefully keep it just below the line. Waterboarding is fairly new as far as the history of torture goes. So really the main thing that you think of when you see it happen to a person is that they're suffocating, that they can't breathe, that their body thinks they're about to drown. The mental aspect of it is not often taken into consideration, and the mental aspect of it is what really qualifies it as torture. So, to answer your question, I think the UN is not prosecuting this correctly.
So then you think that the definition of waterboarding should be, like, if the United States is, as you just said, just below the line, I mean, there are still people who are coming together to figure out what that line is.
Right.
And they're not winging it, so, or they're not unaware of waterboarding. So doesn't that mean, in your research, what were the justifications that you came across that said waterboarding is something that is considered an enhanced interrogation technique as opposed to torture? What was the justification for not classifying it as torture?
So, severe physical pain would be something that, leaves a lasting mark, like a stress position or and something like that. You couldn't really classify the physical pain from waterboarding as too severe because it leaves no lasting effects. So I think that's the reason why. Honestly, I don't know why the mental effects of waterboarding aren't taken into consideration more. I think that they should be.
Good job, Noah.
Thank you.
No.
Can you describe, can you hear me?
A little closer.
Hold it closer. Can you describe what standard has to be reached to trigger the use of torture? It can't be just subjective case by case. Is there an objective set of criteria that has to be reached in order for us to be able to use this?
So you said that it can't just be subjective, but
Is it subjective?
unfortunately it is.
There are no guidelines.
Torture is illegal under U.S. law. So enhanced interrogation was approved by the president himself. They actually had very long meetings. Secretary of State Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, people in the Bush administration had a very long meeting about, Abu Zubaydah was the first person that they used this on. They had very long meetings about whether or not to use this. The main opponent of that was U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, who could not believe that they were even talking about this, but unfortunately he was outnumbered. So the U.S., there are currently 41 detainees in Guantanamo. 14 of them, they've all been there for over 10 years. 14 of them were the ones who were specifically tortured, so CIA officials, National Security Council, they decide who gets treatment like that.
Can you tell me a little bit more about where John McCain stands? I'd be interested since he's a former VA.
Yeah, so I believe about 80% of Republicans in Congress are for enhanced interrogation. John McCain is the first person that comes to mind that isn't. He is very anti-torture, so if some of you don't know, he was a soldier in Vietnam. His plane was down and he was captured by the North Vietnamese. He was tortured every single day for the next 2 years. He did not break once. And when he was offered release, he said that he would not leave unless every other American soldier with him would leave as well. So he knows what he's talking about when he says that he's against torture.
One of the things he said is that there are some jihadists who believe said that they joined some extremist groups where they learned that the U.S. was inflicting torture on kind of their people. Do you really think that that's a reaction to learning that their people were being tortured, or more just a response that they were being held captive by the U.S.?
So it's both of those things. The people who undergo imprisonment in the Middle East by the U.S. are, by and large, the people that become actual jihadists. The citizens, the people that just watch these kinds of things happen, they're the ones who just sort of become anti-U.S. Of course, there are outliers like the people that I talked about in my second point who tended to leave their countries to join extremist groups like this. But torture is not the only reason that things like that happen. A war being there in general causes that to happen. You know, when you're a little Afghan kid and your parents get cut in half by a drone and your house gets blown up, and the United States did that to you, that can make someone pretty extreme.
So did you see any research that, I guess following up, that when there was a release of information on torture, that increased the number of people who were joining these extremist groups, or was there no, did you see any correlation in any research with increased knowledge of torture increasing, the extremist groups?
Right, so, we don't have a census on how many people are in Al-Qaeda or anything like that, but we do figure out the people in those martyrdom videos who say it themselves before they blow themselves up. There's people who try to leave the countries that they're currently in, like the people in Saudi Arabia. So, no, I don't have like a percentage increase or anything like that.
You quoted Alan Dershowitz saying that he was giving this thought experiment of what if we were in this extreme case, and your dismissal of his argument was that it is an improbable thing. But I don't think that necessarily is a completely satisfying answer. Like he's citing a more fundamental question of what if this does work. So you cited in your presentation, you've shown that these enhanced interrogation techniques up till now have not revealed information that is actionable, or if it was actionable, we may not know about it.
Right.
But the fundamental question is, but what if this what if it can work? Should it still not be something that is considered? And I'm not talking about like extreme cases that are clearly over the line of torture. I'm talking about these close to the line, like as you said, just under the line. Why not keep it as an option? Opinions on that?
Okay. So your question is why not keep it as an option?
I'm saying your dismissal of Dershowitz was, that's an improbable scenario. But the heart of the question he's still asking is, what if it does work?
Right, so that's where the FBI's humane, non-coercive interrogation techniques come in. the thing is, once you do this once to a person, it completely turns them against you. So none of the people, I imagine that none of the people in Guantanamo, if we tried to do this to them now, would ever speak to us. But to sort of show, it's the Japanese in World War II, it's the Muslim extremists now, to show them that we are not who their media portrays us to be is a shocker to them and really helps us get them on our side. The FBI, when the Kenyan embassy was bombed, the FBI used rapport building with suspects that they took in. Of course, since there were only suspects, none of them were brutally interrogated and were therefore able to become normal citizens again. They were able to convict 4 terrorists in 3 years after the Kenyan bombing. So, to answer your question, the idea isn't necessarily to handcuff us. The idea is to do something that works better and isn't what's the word? Antithetical.
What a good candy shot.
Now, what are the long-term ramifications of getting rid of torture? We know that one, it's used to retain information, but is there any purpose that it has in just upholding the United States' reputation? Does it serve the purpose of being a deterrent in any way?
Right. So the idea behind that would be like, we look tough doing it, or to put it simply. But that is not the reality. Let's take Vietnam for an example. No one thought the U.S. was tough or powerful when they saw things like the My Lai massacre. That's not the sentiment that happens when people say things like this. That just made North Vietnamese hate us and want to fight against us even more than they already did. People underestimate extremists a lot. Extremists are a crazy bunch. They're willing to go through a lot for what they believe. For example, a man named Fabian von Schlabendorf, he was involved in a bomb plot to assassinate Hitler. He was captured by the Gestapo and tortured beyond imagination with metal spikes, beating so brutal he suffered a heart attack. He gave him a tiny, inconsequential piece of information on purpose because he was scared that he was actually going to tell them something real. And he ended up dying in Gestapo custody for his beliefs. So the point of all that to say that extremists are willing to go through quite a bit, and their beliefs are not deterred by, look at us, I can waterboard this guy. They can do that too.
So a lot of what you've shared with us are opportunity or I guess instances where only a little bit of information has been given away. Have there been times though when the U.S. has actually gleaned a wealth of information from torture?
Yes. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man I talked about earlier, he confessed to having orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. However, in the midst of all of that confession, he also confessed to a ton of things that he did not do and brought up a bunch of extra terrorist plots that didn't actually exist. See, when you tell someone something that's true at first in torture, then after that, you can say whatever you want and they'll believe you. So, yes, it has worked. That small, minute, that's actually the only example I can come up with where it worked.
So yeah, let's talk about this no actionable intelligence from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for a second. So tell me a little bit about, you said there was a Senate committee that looked into the information?
Yes.
Okay, was any of that information, so basically the Senate was investigating the CIA's involvement with interrogating Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Was any of that information that the Senate was given still classified? Do you know, or was it a completely unclassified thing?
Oh, it's completely unclassified.
So the Senate had sort of unfettered access to knowing all of the pieces of intelligence that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gave?
Yes. The reason for that is because the reason none of it is classified is because none of it was actionable.
Now, so when it comes to intelligence, what is the determining factor of it not being a valid piece of intelligence? So, like, the man tells the interrogator something that maybe is not immediately verifiable, or maybe not even verifiable in the next. Like you made reference to the fact that these terrorist plots that don't exist. But how can we make the claim that it is not proper intelligence when we don't have the whole story? Maybe they did exist. I mean, what's the criteria for saying, oh, what he told us was just nonsense?
So it is difficult to, let's say you have a man like Koichi Muhammad who was who's perfectly sound of mind, and he has no signs of being, insane or crazy or anything like that. It is difficult to determine what's actionable and what's not. If you take Abu Zubaydah, for an example, after his experience, he became completely unhinged. The CIA operatives thought that he had developed split personality disorder because of what they did to him. He wrote a journal as 3 different characters and seemed to talk as 3 different characters. He began to lose some of his memories. He forgot what his mother's face looked like, and he couldn't remember his father's name. So in that case, anything that the U.S. Army Attorney General used some very choice words when he said that he was basically crazy. So anything that man says now would not necessarily be actionable, but it is difficult to determine from the sound of mind person what is actionable and what is not. Legally, any information gained from even the slightest bit of torture is not valid in a court.
But it would be if it was waterboarding, because waterboarding is under the line.
Kind of. There's a lot of debate about that. So many of those 14 people have not been formally charged with any crimes, because the only evidence they have is the confessions that they gave while they were being tortured, which is not legally valid. So technically they can't legally charge them, so we just keep them in Guantanamo. So when they attempted to charge Abu Zubaydah with war crimes, but they actually couldn't because his lawyers were able to successfully argue that waterboarding is torture.
No. Do you subscribe to a Christian worldview? And if so, how would this influence your understanding of this topic?
Well, love your enemies. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to fight wars or anything like that, but most of my instincts are based off of Christian worldview. When I saw the pictures from Abu Ghraib, I have never been more disturbed and saddened in my entire life. And I would say that as a result of having Christian worldview.
So is the alternative to follow the FBI's lead, which is rapport building, I believe is what you said, is the tactic that they use? Is that the alternative that you suggest for the CIA as well?
Yes. It's shown to be far more effective than the CIA is doing. It's important to see that the FBI has never undergone the kind of investigation that the CIA did because they have never done any of these things. And all the information that they gained from it is classified because it was actionable.
So what you referenced earlier was from World War II. Kind of in the 2000s, have there been any instances that you're aware of where they've been able to crack a big case?
Right, so I mentioned earlier that there was a bombing in the Kenyan Assembly, 1998, close to 2000s. They used rapport building with their suspects, and they were able to capture 4 terrorists in 3 years, and they were also able to legally convict them in court and put them in actual prisons, not in Guantanamo. So that is the most recent example I have of it being effective.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Let's try. We will be back at 5:05.